In the beginning there was a world that did not yet know itself, a planet suspended in a slow-turning darkness where nothing felt complete. The surface of this early Earth might seem familiar from a distance, a sphere of stone wrapped in cloud and water, yet everything within it moved without agreement. Above, the air gathered in thick, shifting layers, heavy with gases that drifted without rhythm. It pressed downward, restless, unsettled, never finding a steady form below. The ocean stretched across the surface, dark and uneasy, filled with chemical mixtures that had not yet learned to balance. They moved constantly, stirred by heat rising from deep within the planet. Yet they remained separate from the sky above. There was air, and there was water, but between them there was no conversation, no quiet exchange, no shared rhythm, no invisible bridge linking one to the other. They existed side by side, vast and powerful, yet strangely alone. It is easy to imagine that such a world should have been alive, that the presence of oceans and atmosphere would be enough. Yet something essential was missing, something so subtle it could not be seen. The oceans could not truly receive what the air held, and the air could not respond to what the oceans released. Heat moved unevenly, gathering in some regions while vanishing from others, leaving behind a pattern that never settled. Gases lingered where they formed, unable to circulate in ways that might create stability. The entire system felt incomplete, as though two halves of a single design had been placed together without ever learning how to connect. If one could stand within that ancient world, the silence would feel different, not empty but unresolved, like a conversation waiting to begin. The air would hang heavy, the oceans would move without purpose, and nothing would quite align. It would not be obvious what was wrong, only that something was. That quiet absence, that lack of connection, shaped everything that followed, though nothing at the time could recognize it. And so the planet continued, turning slowly, carrying its divided systems forward through time. No signal marked the imbalance. No visible boundary revealed the separation. It simply existed, a world where air and ocean remained strangers, each holding what the other needed, yet neither able to share it. What is difficult to see from that distance is how close everything already was to change. The smallest interaction, the faintest exchange, could begin to alter the balance. But for now, nothing had yet crossed that boundary. The air remained above, the ocean remained below, and between them stretched an unseen distance that defined the entire planet. It is within that distance that the first question quietly forms, not as a sudden thought, but as something felt beneath the surface. How could a world with air and water remain lifeless? Not because it lacked the parts, but because those parts had not yet learned to move together. The answer does not arrive here. It waits, carried forward with the slow turning of the planet, hidden within processes too quiet to notice. And as that quiet continues, the separation begins to shape something deeper, something that will reveal itself only over time, as the consequences of this silence begin to unfold, leading the world toward a question it cannot avoid. What happens when a planet holds everything required for life, yet lacks the connection needed to begin? The imbalance does not shout, it lingers, shaping outcomes in ways too gradual to detect, setting the stage for consequences that will not appear immediately, but will emerge as time stretches, revealing that separation itself can be as powerful as any force, guiding the future of the planet in silence. Until at last, the first faint interactions begin to rise, almost unnoticed, hinting that the distance between air and water may not remain forever, and that something is already beginning to change, even if nothing yet reveals it clearly. The planet did not erupt into chaos. It did not shatter or collapse. Instead, it drifted into something far more subtle, a quiet misalignment that touched everything without ever announcing itself. The air above and the oceans below continued to exist, but they no longer felt like parts of the same world. They moved as if guided by different rules, each responding to forces the other could not fully share. Heat wandered across the surface without pattern. In some regions it gathered, lingering too long, pressing downward into the oceans where it stirred restless currents. In others it vanished too quickly, leaving behind cold stillness that never quite settled. There was no balance, only uneven distribution, like a breath that could not complete itself. The atmosphere shifted, constantly expanding and contracting, carrying gases that had nowhere stable to go. The oceans responded, but only partially, absorbing what they could, rejecting what they could not. Nothing held steady for long. The surface of the planet became a place of inconsistency. Temperatures rose and fell without rhythm. Chemical reactions began but failed to sustain themselves. Gases dissolved into water in one moment, only to be released again in another, without forming any lasting pattern. It was not violent, but it was never calm. Everything was in motion, yet nothing progressed towards stability. From a distance, it would have seemed like a complete world. There was water, vast and deep. There was air, thick and present. But within that appearance lay a quiet failure. The two systems could not align their behavior. They could not create cycles that repeated, conditions that held, or environments that remained stable long enough for anything new to emerge. And that absence changed everything, because life, though not yet present, required something more than ingredients. It required consistency. It required cycles that could repeat, conditions that could persist, interactions that could build upon themselves rather than reset with every passing moment. Without that, even the simplest beginnings could not hold their form. The oceans absorbed gases, but not evenly. Some regions became saturated, while others remained untouched. The atmosphere carried energy, but without regulation, it could not distribute it in a way that supported balance. Each system acted alone, responding only to its own immediate state, never adjusting in response to the other in a meaningful way. It is here that the realization begins to form, not as a sudden understanding, but as a slow awareness. The planet had everything it seemed to need, and yet it could not move forward. It hovered in a state of almost close to something greater, but unable to reach it. That quiet frustration defined this world. If time could be felt, it would have seemed as though the planet was waiting, not for something to arrive, but for something to connect. The air above held possibilities. The oceans below held potential. But without cooperation, those possibilities remained separate, unable to combine into anything lasting. The question lingers longer now, pressing gently against the edges of understanding. How can a world be so complete, and yet so unfinished at the same time? The answer does not appear directly. It begins instead as a shift so small it could easily be missed. A slight change in how gases dissolve, a subtle adjustment in how heat moves. Interactions that were once random begin, in rare moments, to repeat. At first, these moments mean nothing. They pass without recognition, lost within the larger imbalance. But they do not disappear entirely. They leave traces, faint patterns that suggest something different may be forming beneath the surface of this divided world. And in those faint patterns, something begins to bridge the distance, quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, hinting that the separation between air and ocean may not be permanent after all. At first, nothing seems different. The air still drifts above in slow, uneven layers, and the oceans continue their restless motion below low. The imbalance remains, the silence between them still present, still shaping the world in ways too subtle to notice. Yet beneath that silence, something begins to shift, not as a sudden event, but as a quiet persistence. A single interaction occurs almost by accident. A gas from the atmosphere touches the surface of the ocean, and instead of drifting away, dissolves. It does not change the world, it does not even last. But it happens, and then, somewhere else it happens again. These moments are small, so small they leave no visible trace. They do not announce themselves, they do not gather attention. But they repeat. Heat follows a similar path. Instead of moving unpredictably and vanishing, a portion of it lingers at the boundary between air and water. It transfers slowly, crossing from one system into the other. The exchange is incomplete, uneven, fragile, yet it is not entirely lost. Nothing about this feels important at first. The planet remains largely unchanged, still out of sync, still unable to settle into anything resembling stability. But these tiny interactions begin to accumulate, not in one place, not all at once, but scattered across the surface, repeating in different forms, under different conditions. And repetition, even at the smallest scale, begins to matter. Over time, these exchanges do not remain isolated. Gases dissolve and stay a little longer. Heat transfers and spreads more evenly. The boundary between atmosphere and ocean, once silent and unresponsive, begins to carry faint signals between the two. It is not yet a conversation, but it is no longer complete silence. What makes this shift difficult to recognize is its pace. Nothing changes quickly enough to be seen in a single moment. There is no clear before and after, no point where the world suddenly becomes different. Instead, the change stretches across time, unfolding so slowly that it blends into the background of everything else. But something is happening. The air begins, in rare instances, to influence the ocean in ways that last. The ocean, in turn, begins to affect the composition of the air above it. These interactions remain inconsistent, but they are no longer random. They begin to follow faint patterns, subtle repetitions that hint at a deeper connection forming beneath the surface. And with that, a realization begins to emerge. The alignment between air and water was never meant to appear all at once. It was not a single event, not a sudden transformation that reshaped the planet in an instant. It began here, in these quiet exchanges, long before anything could observe them, long before life could depend on them. This is where the foundation was laid, not through force, not through dramatic change, but through persistence, through countless small interactions, each one barely noticeable, yet together forming the earliest threads of connection between two systems that had once remained separate. The world is still not stable, it is still far from ready for what will eventually come, but it is no longer entirely divided. There is movement now, not just within each system, but between them. If one could observe this world across immense stretches of time, the difference would become clear. The oceans would begin to hold more of what the air provides. The atmosphere would begin to reflect what the oceans release. The imbalance would not disappear, but it would begin to soften, shaped slowly by these repeated exchanges. And in that slow shaping, something deeper takes form. The distance between air and water, once absolute, begins to narrow. Not completely, not yet, but enough to suggest that the separation defining this planet may not be permanent, enough to hint that these quiet interactions, repeated over and over again, are building towards something larger, something that cannot yet be seen, but is already in motion. And as these exchanges grow slightly more consistent, slightly more connected, the question shifts once again, no longer focused on what is missing, but on what is beginning. What allowed these fragile interactions to continue, to strengthen, and to move beyond randomness into something that could eventually reshape the entire planet? There is no moment where the change can be seen clearly. No sudden shift, no dividing line where the old world ends and the new one begins. The oceans still move as they always have, rising and falling in slow, restless motion. The atmosphere still hangs above, thick and uneven, carrying its weight across the surface. And yet something within that relationship has begun to settle into a pattern, so quiet that it almost feels imagined. The first sign is not dramatic, it is a pause. Gases that once touched the ocean only briefly now linger a little longer. They dissolve into the water, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to remain, and instead of being released immediately, they are held, stored within the depths for a time before returning to the air above. It is a small change, but it repeats. And with repetition, a rhythm begins to form. The ocean no longer reacts in isolation. It begins to respond in a way that carries memory, holding what it receives, releasing it not at random, but in a pattern that slowly becomes more consistent. The exchanges between air and water are still fragile, still uneven, but they are no longer disconnected. They begin to resemble something familiar, though nothing yet recognizes it. A cycle. Heat follows the same path. Where once it moved without direction, now it begins to settle into the ocean, spreading slowly through its depths. The water absorbs it, carries it, and over time releases it back into the atmosphere in a way that is no longer entirely unpredictable. The surface becomes a place of exchange, a boundary that no longer separates, but connects. If one could observe this process across long stretches of time, it would begin to resemble something alive, not in the sense of life as it will later be understood, but in the sense of movement with purpose. The ocean takes in, holds, and returns. It begins to act not as a passive body, but as something that participates, something that influences what surrounds it. And with that participation, something shifts in the balance of the planet. The atmosphere above, once dominant in its unpredictability, begins to respond. Gases that are absorbed by the ocean no longer remain suspended in the air. Their absence changes the composition of the atmosphere. Even if only slightly, their return, delayed and altered, begins to shape the air in new ways. The ocean is no longer just receiving, it is regulating. This is the turning point, though it arrives without announcement. For the first time, the relationship between air and water is not one of simple contact, but of influence. The ocean begins to moderate what the atmosphere holds, smoothing extremes, redistributing energy, creating a system where change is no longer entirely uncontrolled. The difference is subtle, but it is profound. The planet, once defined by imbalance, begins to lean towards something steadier. Not stable, not yet, but closer than before. The cycles remain incomplete, the patterns still forming, but they are no longer absent. They are beginning. What makes this transformation difficult to grasp is how natural it feels, as though it had always been this way. There is no visible marker to separate the past from the present, no clear indication that the world has crossed into something new. It simply continues, but with a quiet shift in how its parts interact. The ocean breathes. It takes in what the atmosphere offers, holds it, changes it, and returns it in a way that shapes the sky above. The rhythm is slow, stretched across time, but it is there, repeating, strengthening, becoming more consistent with each passing cycle. And as this rhythm deepens, the balance of the planet begins to change in ways that are not immediately visible, but impossible to ignore over time. The question that once lingered in silence begins to evolve. If the ocean can influence the air, if it can shape what exists above it, then what follows is no longer uncertain, but inevitable. The atmosphere, once untouched by the ocean's presence, must now respond. And in that response, something even greater begins to unfold, as the sky itself starts to change, drawn into a relationship that will redefine the entire planet. At first, the sky does not appear to respond. It still stretches above the planet in heavy, shifting layers, carrying its gases without clear direction, as though nothing below has the power to reach it. It feels distant, separate, untouched. But that distance is no longer what it once was. Something beneath it has begun to move with rhythm, and over time, that rhythm begins to rise. The ocean, now absorbing and releasing with growing consistency, starts to alter what remains in the air. Gases that once filled the atmosphere without restraint are drawn downward, dissolved into water, held for a time before returning. But when they return, they are no longer the same. Their timing shifts, their distribution changes. Some remain below longer than before, while others rise slowly, carried back into the sky in patterns that begin to repeat. The sky begins to reflect these changes, not suddenly, not in a way that can be seen in a single moment, but gradually across time. The composition of the atmosphere starts to adjust. Layers that once felt constant begin to thin in some regions and gather in others. The air, once driven only by its own internal movement, begins to respond to what the ocean is doing beneath it. It is here that something subtle but powerful begins to form, a feedback loop. The ocean influences the atmosphere, and the atmosphere, in turn, influences the ocean. Each change in one system creates a response in the other, and that response feeds back again, creating a cycle that did not exist before. The exchange is no longer one-sided. It becomes continuous. The sky is no longer acting alone. Heat, once scattered unevenly, begins to move differently. As the ocean absorbs and releases it with increasing consistency, the atmosphere carries that energy in ways that are less chaotic. Temperature still shifts, but those shifts begin to follow faint patterns, quiet repetitions that slowly replace randomness. The air begins to settle, not completely, but enough to suggest direction. What makes this transformation difficult to notice is that nothing disappears, instability remains. Fluctuations still occur, but beneath them, something steadier begins to guide how those changes unfold. Balance does not appear as stillness. It appears as movement that no longer breaks itself. The realization comes quietly. The sky above is not what it once was. It has been shaped slowly and continuously by the ocean below. What feels constant is, in truth, the result of countless interactions, each one altering the behavior of the atmosphere over time. The air is no longer separate from the ocean, it is evolving with it. This changes everything about how the planet can be understood. What once seemed like two systems loosely connected is becoming something more integrated. The ocean and atmosphere are no longer exchanging fragments without consequence. They are shaping each other. The difference is not dramatic, but it is undeniable. The sky now carries the influence of the ocean, and as that influence deepens, as the feedback between air and water strengthens, the system begins to approach something it has never fully achieved before. Not just interaction, not just influence, but the beginning of something that can sustain itself. The loops grow more consistent, the exchanges become more reliable, patterns begin to repeat with greater clarity. What was once random begins to resemble structure, something capable of lasting beyond a single moment. And within that structure, a new possibility begins to form. If these interactions continue, if they strengthen further, the planet may move beyond imbalance, not by removing change, but by shaping it into cycles that endure. The question now is no longer whether the ocean and atmosphere can influence each other. That has already begun. The question is whether these interactions can stabilize enough to hold, to repeat, to become the first true cycles of a world preparing for something more. And as that question settles, the answer begins to emerge, not as a sudden shift, but as a quiet pattern forming, one that will soon define the rhythm of the entire planet. There is no moment when the planet suddenly becomes stable. No clear boundary where imbalance ends and order begins. Instead, something quieter takes shape, something that does not announce itself, but begins to repeat. What was once scattered starts to return. What was once random begins slowly to follow a path. The exchanges between air and ocean no longer disappear without trace. Gases dissolve, remain, and return in patterns that echo what came before. Heat no longer drifts without direction, but settles into movements that carry forward, spreading, rising, falling, and then repeating again. Each interaction leaves behind a faint imprint, and over time, those imprints begin to align. At first, the pattern is fragile. It breaks easily. It forms in one place and disappears in another. But it returns, and then it returns again. This is how the rhythm begins. Not as something imposed, but as something discovered by the system itself. The ocean takes in what the atmosphere offers and releases it in ways that begin to match earlier exchanges. The atmosphere, in turn, adjusts to those returns, responding not just to the present moment, but to what has already occurred. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything, because repetition creates memory, and memory allows the system to build upon itself. Over time, these repeating interactions grow more consistent. The ocean begins to regulate how much it absorbs and when it releases it. The atmosphere begins to distribute energy in ways that no longer reset with every shift. What once existed as isolated events begins to connect across time, forming sequences that extend beyond a single moment. The planet is still changing, but is no longer starting over. A cycle has formed. It is not perfect, it is not complete, but it holds long enough to repeat, and that is enough to begin shaping stability. The exchanges between air and water begin to sustain themselves, each cycle reinforcing the next, each pattern guiding what follows. There is no single event that creates this shift. No moment where everything falls into place. It emerges gradually built from countless interactions that were once insignificant on their own. Together they form something that did not exist before, a rhythm. This rhythm does not eliminate change. It organizes it. Temperature rises and falls, but within a range that begins to hold. Gases move between ocean and atmosphere, but in ways that repeat, creating a balance that persists longer than before. The system remains dynamic, but it is no longer unstable in the same way. For the first time, the planet begins to maintain itself. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. And that is the turning point. Because stability, even in its earliest form, does not require stillness. It requires continuity. It requires patterns that return, interactions that sustain themselves long enough for something new to emerge within them. The realization comes quietly. Life did not begin with a sudden spark, not with a single moment where everything changed. It began here within this rhythm, within cycles that could hold, repeat, and create conditions that did not vanish as quickly as they appeared. This is what the planet has been moving toward, not perfection, but persistence. The ocean and atmosphere are no longer acting as separate systems. They are moving together, influencing each other in ways that create a shared pattern. The imbalance has not disappeared, but it has been shaped into something that can endure. And within that endurance, a new possibility takes form. If these cycles continue, if they strengthen and align further, then the planet will no longer be defined by instability. It will become something else entirely, a system capable of supporting processes that depend on consistency, processes that require time, repetition, and balance. The rhythm deepens. It becomes less fragile, more reliable, more capable of sustaining itself. The exchanges between air and water no longer feel accidental. They feel connected, as though the planet has begun to learn how to move in harmony with itself. And in that quiet harmony, the next stage begins to approach, because once a system can hold its balance, even briefly, it creates something that did not exist before, a space where change does not erase itself, a moment that can last long enough for something new to take shape. The question now is no longer whether the planet can stabilize. That has already begun. The question is what will emerge within this rhythm, what will take advantage of these cycles, and how this fragile balance will become the foundation for something far more complex, something that has been waiting quietly for the right conditions to finally appear. The planet does not suddenly become calm. The instability remains, the shifting patterns of heat and chemistry, still moving across the surface. But something within that movement begins to change. The rhythm that formed earlier does not eliminate the chaos. It reshapes it, guiding it just enough to create moments where everything aligns, if only briefly. These moments do not appear everywhere. They emerge in isolated pockets, scattered across the oceans, where conditions hold together long enough to form something different. In one region, the temperature settles into a narrow range, no longer rising and falling without limit. In another, gases dissolve into the water and remain there, held long enough to influence what follows. Energy flows through these spaces in ways that begin to repeat, creating small zones where the environment no longer resets with every shift. These are not stable worlds. They are temporary balances, fragile and incomplete, but they are different from anything that came before. The oceans begin to carry more than motion. They begin to carry consistency. Gases that once dissolved and vanished now linger, shaping the chemistry of the water over time. The atmosphere above, still unsettled, no longer overwhelms every interaction below. Its fluctuations soften, not everywhere, but enough to allow certain regions to hold their form for longer than before. These are the first windows. They are small, fleeting, and easily broken, but they return. A region stabilizes, fades, and then stabilizes again. Another appears elsewhere, shaped by different conditions, but following the same quiet pattern. Over time, these windows begin to appear more frequently, not because the planet has become stable, but because it has become capable of holding stability, even if only for a moment. What makes this shift significant is not how long these conditions last, but that they last at all. For the first time, the planet creates spaces where change does not immediately erase itself, where interactions can build upon one another, where processes can continue long enough to form something more complex. The difference is subtle, but it carries enormous consequence. It would be easy to imagine that life requires a perfect environment, a fully stable world where everything is already aligned. But the planet does not reach that point. It does not wait. Instead, it offers something smaller, something less complete, but enough, just enough. Within these windows, chemistry begins to behave differently. Reactions that once started and vanished now persist a little longer. Patterns begin to form within the water, guided by the balance between what the ocean holds and what the atmosphere allows. These patterns are still fragile, still dependent on conditions that can disappear at any moment. But they are no longer impossible. The world is still unpredictable. Storms of imbalance still pass through, disrupting what has begun to form. But they do not erase everything. Some of these windows return shaped again by the same conditions, allowing the same processes to continue. This is where the nature of possibility begins to change. The planet is no longer defined only by what it lacks. It begins to be defined by what it can briefly sustain. And within that brief sustainment lies the foundation for something entirely new. Life does not wait for perfection. It does not require a world that is fully stable or completely predictable. It requires opportunity, a moment where conditions hold together long enough for something to begin. And those moments are now appearing, not everywhere, not constantly, but enough to matter. If one could observe these windows over time, the pattern would become clear. They are becoming more frequent, more consistent, more capable of returning after disruption. The rhythm beneath the chaos is strengthening, shaping the planet in ways that are not immediately visible but increasingly undeniable. The question shifts once again, no longer focused on whether the planet can support life, but on what might begin to take shape within these fleeting moments. What form could emerge in a world that is not fully stable, but no longer entirely hostile? And as these windows open and close, appearing and returning, the stage is set for something unprecedented, something that does not require permanence, only the chance to begin within the brief spaces where the planet becomes, for a moment, just stable enough. Nothing announces the arrival. There is no moment where the planet pauses, no signal that something entirely new has begun. The oceans continue their slow movement, the atmosphere shifts above them, and the fragile windows of balance appear and fade as they always have. Yet within some of those windows, something begins to persist, not as a sudden creation, but as a continuation of the patterns that were already forming. At first, it is impossible to notice. Within the water, where gases remain dissolved just long enough and energy flows without immediate disruption, certain arrangements begin to hold their structure. They are small, far too small to be seen, and fragile, dependent on conditions that still come and go. But unlike everything that came before, they do not disappear immediately. They endure, if only for a moment longer than expected. And then they return. These early forms do not resemble anything familiar. They do not move with intention, do not seek, do not grow in any way that can be easily understood. They exist as part of the environment itself, shaped entirely by the balance between ocean and atmosphere. Without that balance, they cannot hold together. Without those brief windows of stability, they dissolve back into the system from which they emerged. They do not stand apart from the world, they blend into it. The first life does not arrive as something separate. It appears as something continuous with its surroundings, formed from the same exchanges of gases, the same flows of energy, the same patterns that had already begun to repeat. It is not an interruption of the system, it is an extension of it. And for a long time, it changes very little. The planet continues as it always has with its shifting conditions and uneven stability. These early forms remain small, scattered, and dependent. They do not spread rapidly, do not transform the environment in any obvious way. Their presence is subtle, almost invisible, existing within the larger processes that define the planet. But something has changed because now, within those processes, there is participation. These forms do not simply exist within the environment. They interact with it. They take in what surrounds them, hold it, and in doing so, alter it slightly. Gases that dissolve into the water are not returned in exactly the same way. Energy that flows through these structures does not pass unchanged. The difference is almost impossible to detect, but it repeats, and repetition, once again, begins to matter. Over time, these interactions accumulate. The changes are small, but they are not lost. They become part of the cycles that are already forming between air and water. The system that once operated through physical exchange alone now includes something else, something that responds, adapts, and subtly reshapes what it touches. Life has not taken control of the planet. It has not transformed it, but it has begun to influence it. This is the quiet shift that defines this moment. The earliest life does not conquer the earth. It does not spread across its surface or dominate its systems. It becomes part of the existing balance, dependent on it, shaped by it, and in return, beginning to shape it as well. The relationship is small, fragile, and easily overlooked, but it is not one-sided. The environment supports these early forms, providing the conditions they need to exist, and in return, those forms begin to alter the environment. Not dramatically, not immediately, but enough to matter over time. A feedback has begun. What was once a system defined only by air and water now includes something new, something that participates in the exchange, something that carries its own influence into the cycles that are forming. The planet is no longer just stabilizing, it is evolving in a different way. And within that evolution, a new question begins to take shape. If something so small, so quiet, and so easily overlooked can begin to influence the balance of an entire planet, then what happens as those interactions continue, as they repeat, and as they grow more consistent over time? Could these tiny changes, almost invisible in the moment, eventually reshape the world itself, guiding it towards something far more complex than anything that has existed before? At first, the changes are too small to notice. The ocean still moves with its quiet rhythm. The atmosphere still shifts above it, and the fragile balance between them continues to hold, just enough to allow those early forms of life to remain. Nothing appears different from a distance. The planet still looks like a world finding its way towards stability, guided by patterns of heat and chemistry that have only recently begun to repeat. But within those patterns, something new is happening. The earliest life forms, though simple and scattered, are no longer only responding to their environment. They are interacting with it in ways that begin to alter what comes next. Each time they take in what surrounds them, each time they hold and release, something changes, even if that change is too subtle to see in a single moment. Gases that once moved freely between ocean and atmosphere now pass through these living structures. They are absorbed, transformed, and return differently. Not in large amounts, not in ways that disrupt the system, but enough to introduce variation into the cycles that have begun to form. The patterns of exchange are still present, but they are no longer purely physical, they are becoming biological. At first, this influence is faint. It does not reshape the planet all at once. The cycles between air and water continue as they did before, but now they carry traces of something new. The presence of life introduces slight shifts in how gases are stored and released, in how energy moves through the system, in how long certain conditions persist before they change. These shifts are small, but they repeat. And as they repeat, they begin to accumulate. The ocean, which once absorbed and released gases based only on physical processes, now does so in ways that are influenced by the presence of life within it. The atmosphere, which once responded only to the ocean, now indirectly responds to the changes that life introduces into those exchanges. The feedback loop that had formed between air and water becomes more complex, more layered. It now includes life as an active participant. This is the moment where the nature of balance begins to change. The stability that allowed life to emerge is no longer maintained by physical interactions alone. It is shaped in part by the very thing it made possible. Life does not stand outside the system. It becomes part of the mechanism that sustains it. The realization unfolds slowly. The planet is no longer just a place where life can exist. It is becoming a system where life helps maintain the conditions that allow it to continue. This changes the direction of everything, because once life begins to influence its environment, even in the smallest ways, it cannot remain insignificant. Each interaction feeds back into the system, altering it slightly, creating conditions that may support more life, which in turn introduces more changes. The cycle deepens. Life affects the environment, and the environment supports life. That support allows life to expand, even if only slightly, and that expansion introduces new interactions, new variations, new shifts that further shape the system. It is a loop that builds upon itself. At first, the growth is slow, almost imperceptible. The planet does not transform overnight. The changes remain subtle, layered beneath the larger movements of ocean and atmosphere. But over time, the influence of life becomes more consistent, more embedded within the cycles that define the planet's balance. The system is no longer the same as it was before life appeared. It is more complex, more connected, more responsive. And within that complexity, something else begins to emerge, not yet fully visible, but already taking shape. The ocean is no longer just a medium for chemical exchange. The atmosphere is no longer just a carrier of gases. Both are being shaped by the presence of life in ways that extend beyond simple interaction. The balance itself is changing. It is becoming something that can be influenced from within. This is the shift that cannot be undone. Because once life begins to shape the world, even in the smallest ways, it sets in motion a process that continues to build, to expand, and to transform the planet over time. What started as fragile, isolated forms has become part of a larger system, one that now includes life as a force within it. And as that force continues to grow, the next stage begins to approach. The changes introduced by life do not remain hidden forever. They begin to alter the ocean and the sky in ways that become more pronounced, more visible, and more capable of reshaping the planet itself. What was once subtle will begin to reveal itself, and the world, shaped quietly from within, will begin to change in ways no longer easy to overlook. The change does not arrive all at once. The ocean still appears vast and familiar, stretching across the surface with the same slow motion it has always carried. But beneath that movement, something begins to accumulate, something that does not fade with time, but builds upon itself. What was once a system shaped only by physical exchange is now being influenced from within, guided by the quiet presence of life. At first, the differences are almost impossible to detect. The water still holds dissolved gases, still absorbs heat, still releases it back into the atmosphere in patterns that have already begun to stabilize. But within those patterns, subtle alterations begin to appear. The composition of the ocean shifts, not dramatically, but enough to change how it behaves over time. Certain elements remain longer than before, while others are transformed through processes that did not exist in the earlier world. These changes do not happen quickly. They unfold across vast stretches of time, repeating again and again, each cycle adding something new to what came before. Life, still small and dispersed, continues to interact with its surroundings, taking in what the ocean provides and returning it in altered forms. These interactions are simple, but they are constant, and through that constancy they begin to reshape the system itself. The ocean is no longer just absorbing what the atmosphere gives, it is changing what it holds. Clarity begins to shift. Subtle differences in composition alter how light moves through the water, how energy is distributed within it. The structure of the ocean becomes more layered, with variations forming between regions that once behaved in similar ways. These distinctions are not fixed, but they persist long enough to influence what follows. What once felt uniform begins to carry variation. And that variation matters, because it creates new conditions, new possibilities within the ocean itself. Areas that were once unstable begin to hold their structure longer. Chemical interactions that once dissolved quickly now persist, shaped by the presence of life and the changes it introduces. The ocean becomes a place where processes can continue, not just repeat. The transformation is quiet, but it is continuous. What makes this moment remarkable is not the scale of the change, but its direction. The ocean, which once limited the emergence of life through its instability, is now being reshaped into something more supportive. The very system that once resisted life begins to adapt alongside it, gradually becoming more capable of sustaining it. This is not a reversal driven by a single event. It is the result of countless small interactions, each one adding to the system, each one altering it just enough to influence what comes next. Life does not force this change, it participates in it, and through that participation, the ocean evolves. The difference becomes more apparent over time. The exchanges between ocean and atmosphere grow more consistent, not only because of physical cycles, but because of the biological processes now embedded within them. The ocean begins to regulate what it holds more effectively, smoothing extremes, stabilizing interactions, and creating conditions that last longer than before. It is no longer just a medium for exchange. It is becoming a system that shapes those exchanges. The realization forms slowly. The ocean that once struggled to support life is no longer the same ocean. It has been changed by the very presence of life within it, altered in ways that make it more capable of sustaining that life in return. The relationship between environment and organism is no longer one of limitation. It is becoming one of reinforcement. The system is building upon itself, and with each cycle, the changes become slightly more pronounced, slightly more embedded, guiding the planet toward a state that could not have been reached through physical processes alone. The ocean continues to evolve, not in isolation, but as part of a larger system that now includes life as an active force. Its nature is no longer fixed. It adapts, responds, and reshapes itself through the interactions it carries. And as these changes deepen, as the ocean becomes more capable of sustaining and influencing life, the effects do not remain contained within its depths. They begin to rise because what the ocean holds, what it changes, and what it releases does not stay below. It moves upward, carried into the atmosphere, where the next transformation begins to take shape, as the sky itself starts to reflect what the ocean has become. The sky has never been as still as it seems. It stretches above the planet with a sense of permanence, a quiet presence that feels unchanged, as though it has always been this way. But what appears constant is anything but. The air above is not a fixed layer resting over the world. It is something that has been shaped slowly and continuously by everything beneath it. As the ocean changes, the sky begins to follow. The exchanges between water and air, once guided only by physical processes, now carry the influence of life. Gases released from the ocean no longer return in their original form. They rise, altered, shaped by the interactions that took place below. And when they enter the atmosphere, they begin to shift its composition in ways that accumulate over time. At first, the difference is subtle. The atmosphere still holds the same presence, still moves with familiar patterns, but within those patterns, something begins to change. Certain gases become more common, while others begin to fade. The balance between them shifts, not suddenly, but gradually, as each cycle introduces slight variations that are carried forward into the next. The sky begins to adapt. It does not resist these changes. It absorbs them, adjusts to them, and in doing so becomes something new. The composition of the atmosphere is no longer determined only by physical exchange. It is influenced by the biological processes unfolding within the ocean, by the countless interactions taking place at scales too small to see, but large enough to matter over time. This is where the realization begins to take shape. The atmosphere is not separate from life. It is being shaped by it. What was once a system defined by its own internal movement is now part of a larger process, one that includes life as a force within it. The air that surrounds the planet is no longer just a mixture of gases formed in the distant past. It is something that has evolved, something that carries the history of interactions that have unfolded across immense stretches of time. The sky is being rewritten, not in a single moment, not through any dramatic transformation, but through a continuous process of change. Each exchange between ocean and atmosphere adds something new, alters something existing, and over time, those changes build into something that could not have been predicted at the beginning. The air we recognize today is not the air that once existed. It is the result of this process. This is the twist that changes everything. The atmosphere, which might seem like a stable and unchanging feature of the planet, is in fact a record of its evolution. It reflects not just the physical state of the world, but the presence and influence of life within it. Every shift in composition, every balance that forms and holds is part of a larger story, one that has been written slowly over billions of years. The sky carries that story, and it continues to change. The interactions between ocean and atmosphere grow more complex, more layered, as life becomes more established. The feedback loops deepen, with each system influencing the other in ways that reinforce the patterns that have already begun to form. The atmosphere responds to the ocean, and the ocean responds to the atmosphere, but both are now shaped by the presence of life within them. The system is no longer simple, it is interconnected. The changes are not always visible, but they are persistent. The composition of the air continues to adjust, guided by the cycles that now include life as a central force. What once felt static now reveals itself as dynamic, constantly evolving, constantly responding, and within that evolution something begins to stabilize. The fluctuations that once defined the atmosphere begin to settle into patterns that repeat with greater consistency. The extremes soften, the variations become more predictable, and the system as a whole begins to hold its balance for longer periods of time. The sky is no longer just changing, It is becoming part of a system that can sustain itself. And as this transformation continues, as both ocean and atmosphere are reshaped by the influence of life, the planet begins to approach something it has never fully achieved before, a state where the balance is no longer fragile, no longer dependent on isolated conditions, but supported by a network of interactions that reinforce one another. The question now shifts once again. If the ocean has changed and the sky has been rewritten, then what emerges from this connection is no longer just a collection of processes. It is something more complete, something capable of maintaining itself. And within that growing stability, the foundation is laid for a system that will carry forward, shaping the future of the planet in ways that are only just beginning to unfold. There is no single moment when everything locks into place, no sudden stillness, no final alignment where the planet declares itself stable. Instead, something more subtle unfolds. Something that does not end change, but begins to guide it. The ocean, the atmosphere, and the life within them no longer act as separate forces. They begin to move together, not perfectly but consistently enough to shape a system that can hold itself over time. The exchanges between air and water are no longer isolated events. They are connected, each interaction influencing what follows, each cycle building upon the last. Gases move between ocean and atmosphere in patterns that repeat. But now those patterns are shaped by life as well. The ocean absorbs, transforms, and releases. The atmosphere responds, redistributes, and returns. Life participates, altering the flow in ways that are small but continuous. This is where the system begins to close in on itself. A loop forms, not as a perfect circle, but as a repeating path where each part influences the others. The ocean changes the atmosphere. The atmosphere changes the ocean. Life interacts with both, shaping how those changes occur, and in turn responding to the conditions that result. Nothing operates in isolation anymore. Everything is connected through a network of interactions that feed back into one another. At first, this loop is fragile, easily disrupted by the same instabilities that once defined the planet. But it holds long enough to repeat, and with each repetition it strengthens. The patterns become more reliable. The exchanges become more consistent. What once felt temporary begins to persist. Temperature no longer shifts without limit. It rises and falls within ranges that begin to stabilize. Heat is absorbed by the ocean, distributed through its depths, and returned to the atmosphere in ways that prevent extremes from dominating for long. The atmosphere carries that energy across the planet, redistributing it in patterns that begin to repeat. Chemical composition follows the same path. Gases are no longer present in random amounts. They are regulated through the interactions between ocean, atmosphere, and life. When one element becomes too abundant, it is absorbed or transformed. When another becomes scarce, it is released or replenished. The system does not eliminate imbalance, but it responds to it. This is the shift that defines this moment. Balance is no longer something the planet is moving toward. It is something the planet begins to maintain. Not perfectly, not permanently, but continuously. The difference is profound, because once a system can maintain itself, even imperfectly, it no longer depends entirely on external conditions. It becomes capable of adjusting from within. The feedback loop does not stop change, but it shapes how change unfolds, preventing it from breaking the system entirely. The planet becomes something more than a collection of processes. It becomes a system. The ocean, atmosphere, and life are no longer separate components interacting occasionally. They are parts of a larger structure, each one contributing to the stability of the whole. Their interactions create a balance that can persist, not because it is fixed, but because it is constantly being adjusted. The realization settles slowly. Earth is no longer just changing, it is regulating. The cycles that once emerged from repetition have now deepened into something more resilient. They no longer fade as easily. They continue, even when disrupted, returning again and again, guided by the feedback that now connects every part of the system. This is what allows the planet to hold its balance over time, not through stillness, but through movement that does not collapse. The system is dynamic, always shifting, always responding, but no longer losing its structure with every change. It absorbs disruptions, adjusts, and continues. The feedback loop does not prevent instability, but it prevents instability from becoming permanent. And within that stability, something else begins to unfold. Because once the planet can maintain its balance, even in a fragile form, it creates conditions that can last longer than before. Conditions that allow processes to continue, to build, and to expand. Life, once limited by instability, now finds itself within a system that can support it more consistently. The environment no longer resets as quickly. The windows of opportunity grow wider, last longer, and return more reliably. The foundation has been set. The planet is no longer preparing for stability. It has begun to live within it. And with that shift, the story moves forward, not toward balance, but beyond it into a world where that balance allows life to spread, to diversify, and to reshape the planet in ways that will continue to unfold over time. The change is not sudden, and it is not loud. The planet does not transform overnight into something full and thriving. Instead, the shift unfolds quietly, carried by the same steady rhythm that has begun to hold the system together. The balance between ocean and atmosphere, now more consistent, creates a world where conditions no longer vanish as quickly as they appear. And within that steadiness, life finds something it has never truly had before. Time, with each cycle that holds, with each pattern that repeats, life gains a little more space to continue. The earliest forms, once confined to fragile pockets of stability, begin to persist beyond those narrow boundaries. They do not move with intention, not at first, but they endure, and through that endurance, they begin to spread. It starts slowly. In one region of the ocean, life remains long enough to influence its surroundings, and when conditions shift, traces of it remain. In another, similar patterns emerge, shaped by slightly different balances of temperature and chemistry. These regions are not identical, but they are connected through the same underlying rhythm, allowing life to appear, disappear, and then return again. And over time, those returns begin to overlap. The ocean becomes less uniform. Variations in conditions, once barriers, begin to act as pathways. Life does not remain fixed in one place. It extends outward, carried by currents, shaped by differences in environment, adapting in small ways to the conditions it encounters. What was once limited begins to expand. Not everywhere at once, but steadily. The stability of the planet does not remove change. It supports it. It allows differences to exist without destroying what has already formed. Within this balance, life begins to experiment, not through intention, but through variation. Slight differences in structure, in interaction, in response to the environment begin to appear, and some of those differences persist. This is how diversity begins. Not as a sudden emergence of complexity, but as a gradual unfolding of variation, shaped by the conditions that now hold long enough for those variations to matter. Life becomes more resilient, not because the world has become perfect, but because it has become consistent enough to allow adaptation. The ocean carries these changes. Sand? Currents move not just water and heat, but the presence of life itself, distributing it across regions that were once too unstable to support it. As life spreads, it encounters new conditions, and in those conditions it changes again. Some forms remain simple. Others begin to take on new characteristics, shaped by the environments they persist within. The process is slow, but it does not stop. With each cycle, life becomes slightly more established, slightly more capable of enduring change without disappearing. The feedback loop between life and environment deepens, reinforcing the balance that now supports it. The ocean becomes more than a place where life exists. It becomes a network through which life expands. And with that expansion comes influence. The presence of life begins to reach more of the system, affecting larger portions of the ocean, and through it, the atmosphere above. The changes remain subtle, but they are no longer isolated. They spread, carried through the same patterns that now define the planet's stability. The realization grows clearer. Stability does not limit life. It enables it. Without the steady cycles that now hold, life would remain confined, unable to persist long enough to expand. But with those cycles in place, life gains the opportunity to explore the planet, to adapt to its variations, and to build upon its own presence over time. The world is still changing, but now, those changes do not erase what came before. They shape it, allowing life to continue, to spread, and to become something more than it was at the beginning. The planet is no longer just a place where life can exist in isolated pockets. It is becoming a world where life can move, adapt, and grow. And as this growth continues, as life becomes more widespread and more diverse, it begins to introduce something new into the balance itself. Because complexity does not simply add to the system, it changes it. The question that begins to form is no longer about whether life can spread. That has already begun. The question is how this growing complexity, this increasing diversity of life, will begin to influence the balance that made it possible, and whether the system that supports life can continue to hold as life itself becomes more intricate, more connected, and more capable of shaping the world around it. At first, the expansion of life feels like a continuation of what has already begun. The ocean carries it, the atmosphere supports it, and the balance between them holds steady enough for life to persist and spread. But as life becomes more widespread, something begins to shift, not in the stability itself, but in how that stability behaves. Life is no longer uniform. Where once there were only simple forms similar in their structure and interaction, differences begin to appear. Some adapt to warmer regions, others to cooler depths. Some interact with the ocean in one way, others in ways that alter their surroundings more noticeably. These variations are small at first, but they do not remain isolated. They repeat, persist, and begin to shape the system differently. The ocean, once influenced by life in subtle, consistent ways, now responds to a growing diversity of interactions. Different forms of life absorb and release gases differently. They influence chemical processes in ways that do not always align. The patterns that once formed a relatively simple feedback loop begin to layer over one another, creating new pathways of exchange. The system becomes more complex. The atmosphere begins to reflect this as well. The gases that move between ocean and air are no longer shaped by a single type of interaction, but by many. Some are absorbed more quickly, others more slowly. Some are transformed before returning to the atmosphere, while others pass through unchanged. The result is not instability, but variation within the balance, and that variation begins to matter, because the balance that once held through simple repetition must now respond to multiple influences at once. The feedback loop between air, water, and life is no longer a single cycle. It becomes a network of cycles, each interacting with the others, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes competing. The rules begin to change. Stability is no longer maintained by consistency alone. It must now adjust to complexity. This is where the quiet tension begins to rise. The same stability that allowed life to grow now faces new pressures. The more life diversifies, the more ways it interacts with the environment, and those interactions do not always align in a single direction. Some processes support the existing balance, while others begin to push against it, altering conditions in ways that must be absorbed and adjusted. The system does not break, but it is tested. The ocean and atmosphere, once guided by simpler patterns, must now respond to a growing number of influences. The balance does not disappear, but it becomes more dynamic, more responsive, more dependent on its ability to adapt. This is the shift that defines this stage. Balance is no longer something that can remain unchanged. It must evolve. The realization unfolds slowly. The growth of life does not simply add to the system, it transforms it. Each new variation, each new interaction introduces changes that ripple through the existing cycles. The feedback loop deepens, becoming more intricate, more layered, more capable of both stabilizing and destabilizing the system, depending on how those interactions align. The planet is no longer a system shaped by simple exchanges. It is becoming a system shaped by complexity itself, and within that complexity lies both strength and uncertainty, because while the system can now support a wider range of conditions, it must also manage a greater number of variables. The balance that once held through repetition must now hold through adaptation, adjusting continuously to the changes introduced by life itself. The question begins to shift again, no longer focused on how life can grow, but on how the system can continue to support that growth as it becomes more complex. Whether the balance that has formed can endure under the weight of increasing diversity, or whether it will be pushed into new states that have yet to be understood. The planet continues to move, to adjust, to respond, but the nature of that response is changing, and as complexity continues to rise, the system approaches a new threshold, one where stability is no longer just maintained, but constantly negotiated, shaped by the very life it was once only meant to support. The next question waits just beneath the surface. Can this balance hold, not just in simplicity, but in complexity? And what happens if the forces that sustain it begin to pull in different directions? The balance does not settle into permanence. It does not reach a final state where everything remains fixed and unchanged. Instead, it continues, shaped by the same forces that created it, adjusting with every cycle, responding to every shift, carrying forward without ever becoming complete. The ocean moves, the atmosphere flows, and life continues to interact within that movement, each part influencing the others in ways that never fully stop. What once felt like an achievement begins to reveal itself as something else entirely, a process. The cycles that now define the planet do not hold because they are perfect. They hold because they are constantly adjusting. When conditions begin to shift, the system responds. When temperature rises beyond its usual range, the ocean absorbs more heat, redistributing it through its depths. When chemical balances begin to tilt, life and environment interact in ways that pull them back, not instantly, but gradually over time. Nothing remains still. The stability that has formed is not a state of rest. It is a state of motion that no longer collapses under its own changes. The feedback loops between air, water, and life continue to operate, not in a fixed pattern, but in patterns that evolve as the system itself evolves. This is what makes the balance possible, not the absence of change, but the ability to respond to it. The planet becomes something that can absorb variation without losing its structure. The cycles stretch and contract, shift and adjust, but they do not disappear. They return again and again, shaped by what has changed, yet still connected to what came before. The realization deepens. Balance is not something the planet reached and then held. It is something the planet continuously creates. Each moment contributes to it. Each interaction reinforces or reshapes it. The ocean does not simply follow a pattern. It adjusts that pattern based on what it encounters. The atmosphere does not carry gases in fixed proportions. It reflects the changes introduced through ongoing exchange. Life does not remain unchanged. It adapts, and through that adaptation, it alters the system in return. Everything is in motion, and that motion is what sustains the balance. The idea of stability begins to shift. It is no longer seen as a destination, a point where the planet finally arrived. It is understood as something that exists only because it is constantly maintained, constantly adjusted, constantly shaped by the interactions that define the system. This understanding changes how the planet can be seen. The ocean is not just a stable body of water. It is a system that responds to change, redistributing energy, altering composition, maintaining conditions that can persist. The atmosphere is not a fixed layer above it. It is a dynamic part of the system, shifting in response to what happens below and within it. Life is not just something that exists within these systems. It is part of the process that keeps them functioning together. They form something that cannot remain still. And yet, through that movement, they create continuity. The planet does not hold its balance by resisting change. It holds it by moving with change, adjusting to it, reshaping itself through every cycle. This is what allows the system to persist over time, not unchanged but unbroken. There is no final state waiting at the end of this process. No point where the balance is complete. There is only continuation. The cycles continue to evolve, the interactions deepen, and the system carries forward, shaped by everything that has come before, and everything that is still unfolding. The story of air, water, and life does not end here. It extends beyond this moment, carried into every future interaction, every new condition, every shift that the planet will encounter. The balance remains, but not because it has been achieved, because it is being maintained. And within that ongoing maintenance lies both strength and vulnerability. Because a system that must constantly adapt can also be tested. The forces that shape the planet do not stop, and as they continue to act both from within and from beyond, they begin to place new pressures on the balance that has formed. The question that now begins to rise is not whether the system can adapt, it is how far that adaptation can go. And what happens when the forces acting upon it begin to push it beyond the range it has learned to hold. The balance still holds, but it no longer feels as quiet as before. The ocean continues its steady exchange with the atmosphere. Life remains woven into those cycles, and the patterns that once brought stability are still present. Yet something beneath that steadiness begins to shift, not in a way that announces itself, but in a way that can be felt like a subtle tension carried within the system itself. At first, the changes are small. Temperature drifts slightly beyond its usual range in certain regions. Not enough to disrupt everything, but enough to linger longer than expected. The ocean absorbs more heat in some areas, less in others, creating differences that were once smoothed out more easily. These variations do not break the system, but they introduce unevenness into patterns that had begun to feel consistent. The atmosphere responds, gazes shift in concentration, not dramatically, but in ways that alter how energy moves through the air. Some regions retain more heat, while others release it too quickly. The balance adjusts, as it always has, but the adjustments begin to take longer, requiring more time to return to equilibrium. The system is still working, but it is working harder. What makes these changes difficult to notice is their scale. They do not appear as sudden disruptions or visible events. They emerge gradually, carried within the same cycles that maintain stability. The feedback loops between air, water, and life continue to operate, but they begin to stretch, adapting to variations that push them slightly beyond what they have previously held. Life itself contributes to this shift. As it has grown more complex, its interactions with the environment have become more varied. Some processes strengthen the balance, while others introduce changes that ripple outward through the system. These influences do not act in isolation. They combine, overlap, and sometimes conflict, creating patterns that are less predictable than before. The system remains intact, but it becomes more sensitive. The interconnectedness that once ensured stability now reveals another side. Because everything is linked, a small change in one part of the system can influence many others. A shift in ocean chemistry affects the atmosphere. A change in atmospheric composition alters how energy is distributed. Life responds to those changes, and in responding, it introduces new variations. The connections that hold the system together also carry its disturbances. This is where the quiet tension begins to grow. The planet is no longer fragile in the way it once was. It does not collapse under minor changes, and it does not lose its balance easily. But its stability depends on the continuous interaction of many parts, each one adjusting to the others. When those adjustments become more complex, more varied, the system must respond in equally complex ways. And that response is not always immediate. There are moments where the balance lags behind the changes, where the system takes longer to return to its usual patterns. These moments are brief, but they leave traces, small deviations that begin to accumulate over time. The realization settles slowly. Stability does not eliminate vulnerability. It manages it. The balance that supports life is not fixed. It is maintained through constant adjustment, and that adjustment requires time, energy, and coordination between all parts of the system. When any part begins to shift more than expected, the entire system must respond. And sometimes that response is not enough to immediately restore what was. The planet continues to move, to adapt, to adjust. But the ease with which it once held its balance begins to change. The cycles remain, but they stretch, pulled slightly out of alignment before returning again. The difference is subtle, but it is there. The balance trembles, not breaking, not collapsing, but revealing that it is not as permanent as it once seemed. It depends on conditions that can shift, on interactions that can change, on forces that are not always within the system's control. And as these small disruptions continue, as they repeat and begin to overlap, the question that emerges is no longer quiet. What happens when these shifts grow stronger, When the system is pushed further beyond its usual range, when the balance is no longer just adjusting, but struggling to keep up with the changes it must contain. Because what begins as a tremble does not always remain small, and within that movement lies the possibility that the balance itself may be tested in ways it has never experienced before. The tremble does not remain gentle forever. There are moments when the quiet adjustments that once restored balance begin to strain, when the cycles that held the system together are pushed beyond what they can easily contain. These moments do not arrive as isolated events. They emerge from the same interactions that once created stability, unfolding slowly until the system itself begins to shift in ways that are no longer subtle. At first, the changes feel like an extension of what has already been happening. Temperature rises a little higher or falls a little lower, lingering beyond its usual range. The ocean absorbs more than it can easily redistribute, holding energy that begins to accumulate rather than flow. The atmosphere carries this imbalance, spreading it across regions that were once buffered from extremes. Then the patterns begin to reinforce themselves. Heat, once regulated through exchange, starts to build in certain areas, intensifying the conditions that created it. Chemical balances shift, and instead of correcting themselves, they begin to move further in the same direction. Gases that once cycled between ocean and atmosphere with consistency now accumulate unevenly, altering how the system responds to energy. The feedback loop tightens. What once stabilized the planet begins to amplify change. The ocean releases more of what it has absorbed, not in balance but in excess. The atmosphere responds, but instead of restoring equilibrium, it carries the excess further, spreading instability across the system. Life, still part of the cycle, reacts to these shifts, but its responses do not always counter the change. Sometimes they contribute to it, adding new layers to the imbalance that is already growing. The system does not fail immediately. It stretches, but there are points where the stretch becomes too great, where the interactions that once worked together begin to pull in opposing directions. The ocean struggles to regulate the energy it holds. The atmosphere becomes less capable of distributing that energy evenly. The feedback loops that once reinforced stability begin to drive the system further away from it. This is where the tension becomes undeniable. There are periods where the balance does not simply adjust. It falters. The planet moves into states that are far removed from what it once held, where conditions become extreme, not because something external has forced them, but because the system itself has carried its own processes too far. The same cycles that once created stability now push the system toward instability, driven by the very connections that made balance possible. This is the twist that changes the understanding of everything. Stability is not always self-correcting. The processes that maintain it can, under certain conditions, overwhelm it. The ocean, which once absorbed excess heat and smoothed extremes, can become saturated, unable to continue that role. The atmosphere, which once redistributed energy, can begin to trap or lose it in ways that intensify the imbalance. Life, which once helped regulate the system, can contribute to changes that push it further from equilibrium. The system becomes caught in its own feedback. The cycles continue, but they no longer return the planet to the same state. Instead, they carry it further into conditions that are harder to reverse. The balance does not disappear entirely, but it becomes strained, stretched across a range that challenges its ability to hold. There are moments when the system comes close to breaking, not in a single collapse, but in a gradual movement toward extremes that test every part of the planet's ability to respond. The interactions between air, water, and life continue, but they no longer align in ways that restore stability quickly. Recovery becomes slower, less certain, more dependent on conditions that are themselves shifting. The planet enters a state of uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, a new question emerges. If the same processes that created balance can also drive it toward instability, then what determines whether the system recovers or continues to move further away from equilibrium? Because these moments do not last forever, the system does not remain at its limits indefinitely. But what follows is not guaranteed. And as the planet reaches these extremes, as the balance is pushed to the edge of what it can sustain, the next stage begins to take shape, not as a continuation of what came before, but as a test of whether the system can return. whether it can find its way back from conditions that nearly broke it entirely. The system does not recover all at once. There is no sudden reversal, no moment where the planet shifts back into balance, as if nothing had happened. Instead, the movement slows, the extremes begin to soften, and the forces that once pushed the system outward start, quietly, to draw it back. At first, the change is almost unnoticeable. The ocean, which had absorbed more than it could easily release, begins to take in what remains in excess. Not quickly, not completely, but enough to ease the strain. The atmosphere, once carrying imbalances across the planet, begins to redistribute them more evenly, smoothing the sharp edges of temperature and chemical variation. The feedback loops do not disappear. They adjust. What once amplified instability begins, slowly, to counter it. The same connections that carried the system toward its limits now begin to guide it away from them. Heat that had built up begins to spread more widely, reducing the intensity of extremes. Gases that had accumulated unevenly are gradually absorbed, transformed, or redistributed through interactions that regain their balance over time. Life responds as well, not with intention but through adaptation. The forms that persist are those that can endure the shifting conditions, those that can continue within the changing environment. As they interact with the system, they begin to influence it again, not in the direction of instability, but toward a state that allows them to remain. The process is slow and uneven. There are moments where the system seems to move back toward balance, only to shift again, pulled by lingering forces that have not yet settled. The recovery does not follow a straight path. It moves in cycles, advancing, pausing, adjusting, and then advancing again. But it continues. That is what defines this stage. The system does not remain at its limits. It finds ways through its own interactions to move back toward conditions it can sustain. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to hold. The realization emerges gradually. Stability is not about avoiding disruption. It is about recovering from it. The balance that supports life is not fragile because it can be broken. It is resilient because it can return. The cycles between ocean, atmosphere, and life are not fixed patterns that collapse when pushed too far. They are processes that adapt, that reshape themselves in response to change, and that continue even after being stretched beyond their usual range. This is what allows the planet to endure, not the absence of extremes, but the ability to move through them and emerge on the other side. The ocean continues to absorb and release, adjusting its role as conditions shift. The atmosphere redistributes energy and composition, responding to what the ocean and life introduce into the system. Life itself persists, not unchanged but adapted, contributing once again to the cycles that now begin to stabilize. The system reforms, not as it was before, but as something slightly different, shaped by what it has passed through, and within that difference lies its strength. Because each disruption, each period of instability, leaves behind changes that become part of the system moving forward. The balance that returns is not identical to the one that existed before. It is influenced by what has occurred, carrying forward the adjustments that allowed recovery to happen. The planet learns in its own way, not through awareness but through repetition, through cycles that build upon themselves, through interactions that refine how the system responds to change. The tension begins to ease. The extremes fade, the variations settle, and the cycles that define the planet's balance begin to hold once again. The system is not untouched, but it is intact, and that is enough, because what matters is not that the balance was never broken. It is that it was restored. This is the deeper nature of the planet's stability. It is not fixed, not permanent, not immune to disruption. It is resilient. And within that resilience lies the foundation for everything that follows. Because as these cycles of disruption and recovery repeat, as the system continues to adapt and reform, they begin to shape the long-term path of the planet itself, influencing how life evolves, how the environment changes, and how the balance continues to unfold over time. The story does not end with recovery, it expands. And in that expansion, the patterns of resilience begin to define not just the stability of the planet, but the direction of its future, carrying forward the effects of every disruption, every adjustment, and every return to balance that has shaped the world so far. The world does not become easier. The cycles continue. The balance holds and shifts, and the planet moves through periods of calm and strain, never fully settling into stillness. Yet within this constant motion, life does not retreat. It changes. At first, the changes are small. The earliest forms, once shaped entirely by their environment, begin to respond to it in new ways. When conditions shift, some do not endure, fading back into the system that once held them. But others remain, not because the world has become more stable, but because they have adjusted to it. The difference is subtle. Where once life depended entirely on narrow conditions, it begins to tolerate variation. Slight differences in temperature, in chemistry, in energy flow no longer lead to immediate collapse. Some forms persist across a wider range, holding together even as the environment moves around them. This is where adaptation begins, not as a sudden transformation, but as a quiet shift in how life interacts with the world. Each disruption becomes a filter shaping what remains and what does not. Those that endure carry forward the traits that allowed them to survive, and through repetition, those traits begin to define what life becomes. The process is slow, but it does not stop. With each cycle of imbalance and recovery, life encounters new conditions. Some are familiar, others entirely different from anything that came before. These conditions do not arrive in isolation. They overlap, combine, and change over time, creating a world that is never entirely predictable. And yet, life continues. It does not wait for the planet to become perfectly stable. It does not require conditions to remain constant. Instead, it adjusts, finding ways to persist within the movement itself. Where one form cannot endure, another emerges that can. Where one interaction fails, another begins to take shape. Variation becomes strength. The ocean, once a uniform environment for early life, now presents differences that shape how organisms exist within it. Some forms adapt to shallow regions, where energy flows more directly. Others persist in deeper areas where conditions are more stable but limited. Each environment creates its own challenges, and within those challenges, life continues to change. The atmosphere plays its part as well. Shifts in composition, in energy distribution, in the balance between gases introduce new pressures, new opportunities. Life does not remain separate from these changes. It responds to them, adjusting its interactions, altering how it takes in and releases what surrounds it. The system becomes more dynamic. Life is no longer a passive participant within the balance. It becomes something that moves with it, adapting to its changes, finding ways to endure within its fluctuations. The feedback loop between life and environment deepens, not just through influence, but through response. This is the realization that begins to take hold. Life does not depend on a perfectly stable world. It thrives in a world that changes. The disruptions that once seemed like threats become part of the process that shapes life itself. Each shift creates new conditions, and within those conditions, new forms emerge that can persist where others could not. The system does not move toward simplicity. It becomes more complex, more varied, more capable of sustaining life in different ways. Adaptation is not a single event. It is continuous. The planet continues to change, and life changes with it, each influencing the other in ways that build upon what has already occurred. The balance between ocean, atmosphere, and life remains in motion, but within that motion, life becomes more resilient, more capable of enduring what comes next. And as that resilience grows, as life becomes more flexible and more varied, its role within the system begins to shift once again. Because adaptation does not only allow life to survive, it allows it to expand its influence. The changes that life undergoes do not remain contained within individual forms. They begin to affect how life interacts with the environment as a whole, shaping the balance in new ways, introducing new patterns into the cycles that define the planet. The question begins to shift forward. If life can adapt to the changing world, then how does that adaptation begin to reshape the balance itself? And what happens when life is no longer just responding to the system, but actively redefining how that system works? At first, life changes quietly, adapting to the rhythms of the planet, adjusting to shifts in ocean and atmosphere without ever standing apart from them. But over time, as those adaptations accumulate, something begins to shift in scale. The influence of life, once subtle and localized, begins to spread outward, carried through the same cycles that connect every part of the system. It is not a single form that creates this change, it is many. Countless small organisms, each interacting with their environment in simple ways, begin to act together, not by intention, but through repetition. Each exchange of gases, each transformation of chemical elements, each movement of energy contributes to patterns that extend far beyond any individual interaction. The ocean reflects this first. Life within it begins to alter its chemistry more consistently. Gases are absorbed and released in ways that are no longer random or purely physical. The presence of life introduces direction into these exchanges, shaping how elements move, how long they remain, and how they return to the atmosphere. These changes are not immediate, but they build layer upon layer, cycle after cycle. The atmosphere follows. What rises from the ocean carries the imprint of life, and as those gases enter the air, they begin to reshape its composition. The balance between elements shifts, not because of a single event, but because of the continuous influence of countless interactions occurring below. Over time, the atmosphere becomes something different from what it once was, reflecting not just the state of the planet, but the activity of life within it. The scale of this transformation is difficult to see in any single moment, but it is undeniable across time. Life is no longer confined to isolated regions. It spreads across the planet, carried by currents, shaped by environments, adapting and persisting in ways that allow it to reach nearly every part of the system. And wherever it exists, it interacts, influencing the balance between ocean and atmosphere in ways that accumulate and extend. The feedback loop deepens. The ocean shapes the atmosphere shapes the ocean. Life influences both, and in doing so, becomes part of the process that determines how the system behaves. The interactions are no longer small or isolated. They are global, connected across distances, carried through cycles that link every part of the planet together. This is where the shift becomes clear. Life is no longer just adapting to Earth. It is shaping it. The realization unfolds slowly, but once seen, it cannot be undone. The balance that allows life to exist is no longer maintained solely by physical processes. It is influenced, guided, and in some ways controlled by the presence of life itself. The composition of the atmosphere, the chemistry of the ocean, the flow of energy across the planet all carry the imprint of biological activity. The planet becomes something more than a stage for life. It becomes a system co-created by it. This does not mean that life controls everything. The forces that shape the planet remain vast, complex, and often beyond the influence of any single process. But life has become a central part of how those forces interact, how they balance, and how they evolve over time. The system is no longer one-directional. It is interactive. The changes introduced by life do not remain separate from the environment. They feed back into it, altering the conditions that life itself depends on. This creates a cycle that is both powerful and delicate, capable of sustaining stability, but also capable of introducing new variations that the system must absorb. The planet is now shaped from within, not just by the movement of ocean and atmosphere, but by the countless interactions of living systems that exist within them. Each organism contributes in its own way, and together they form a force that extends across the entire planet. The question that begins to rise is no longer about whether life influences the system. That is already clear. The question is how far that influence can extend, and what it means for a planet where life is not just a result of balance, but an active force in maintaining and reshaping it. Because as this influence grows, as life becomes more deeply embedded within every cycle, the nature of the planet itself begins to change. It is no longer just a world where systems interact. It is becoming something fully integrated, a system where ocean, atmosphere, and life are no longer separate elements, but parts of a single connected whole that moves together, adjusts together, and continues to evolve as one. The planet no longer feels like a collection of separate parts. The ocean, the atmosphere, and life within them have moved beyond simple interaction. They have become intertwined, connected through cycles that repeat, adjust, and continue without pause. What once existed as distinct systems now behaves as something unified, something that carries its own balance forward through time. This is not a sudden transformation. It is the result of everything that has come before. Each exchange between air and water, each adaptation within life, each disruption and recovery has added to a network of interactions that now shapes the entire planet. The feedback loops that once formed slowly and imperfectly have deepened, becoming more consistent, more capable of responding to change without collapsing. The system begins to regulate itself, not in a way that eliminates variation, but in a way that contains it. When conditions begin to shift, the interactions between ocean, atmosphere, and life respond, adjusting the flow of energy, the movement of gases, and the structure of the environment. These responses are not planned or directed. They emerge naturally from the connections that now define the system. The balance holds because it is active. It is maintained through constant interaction, through processes that never stop adjusting to one another. The ocean absorbs and releases, the atmosphere distributes and transforms, and life participates in ways that influence both. Together, they create patterns that can persist even as the conditions within them continue to change. This is where the realization begins to take shape. The planet behaves as though it is regulating itself, not as a living organism in the way life exists within it, but as a system that carries similar qualities. It responds to change, adjusts to maintain conditions, and continues to function through cycles that reinforce its stability over time. The difference is subtle, but it is profound. Earth is no longer just a place where processes occur. It is a system where those processes are connected in ways that allow it to maintain itself. The ocean does not act alone. Its changes influence the atmosphere, and the atmosphere responds in ways that affect the ocean in return. Life is not separate from this exchange. It is embedded within it, shaping how those interactions unfold, contributing to the cycles that now define the planet's balance. The system becomes self-regulating, not perfectly, not without disruption, but consistently enough to sustain conditions that allow life to continue. The feedback loops that connect every part of the planet do not simply react to change. They adapt to it, reshaping themselves to maintain a balance that can persist over long periods. This creates a form of harmony, not a static harmony, not a final state where everything remains unchanged, but a dynamic one, where movement itself becomes the source of stability. The cycles do not stop, they continue adjusting, evolving, carrying forward the patterns that have formed over time. The awe comes from understanding the scale. What appears as separate systems, air, water, life, are part of something larger, something that behaves as a single connected whole. The interactions that occur within one part of the system extend outward, influencing others, creating a network that spans the entire planet. The balance is not held in one place. It exists everywhere. And because it exists everywhere, it can respond from anywhere. A change in one region can be absorbed and adjusted through the system as a whole, allowing the planet to maintain its structure even as individual parts shift and change. This is what allows the system to persist. Not perfection, but continuity. The planet does not remain unchanged. It evolves, it adapts, it moves through cycles of stability and disruption. But through all of this, the connections between ocean, atmosphere, and life remain, guiding the system back toward conditions it can sustain. The realization settles quietly. Earth is not just a planet. It is a system that behaves as though it is alive, not in the sense of awareness, but in its ability to maintain itself, to respond to change, and to continue through time. And within that realization lies a deeper question. If the planet can regulate itself, if it can maintain conditions that allow life to exist, then what does that mean for the present, for the future, for the balance that continues even now? Because the story does not end with the emergence of this system, it continues, and the balance that has formed, shaped by everything that has come before, still moves forward, still adjusts, still responds to forces that have not yet been fully understood, carrying the planet into a future that remains part of the same ongoing process. The world feels steady. The sky stretches above, the ocean moves below, and everything appears settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer demands attention. The air feels familiar, the water predictable, and the balance between them seems complete, as though it has always existed in this form. It is easy to believe that what surrounds us is stable, finished, no longer changing in any meaningful way. But that is not the case. The same processes that shaped the earliest moments of the planet are still unfolding, still active, still guiding the balance between atmosphere and ocean with every passing moment. Nothing has stopped. Nothing has reached an end. The system continues quietly beneath the surface of what can be easily seen. The ocean is never still. Beneath its surface, gases are constantly dissolving and rising, moving between water and air in patterns that have been repeating for ages. Heat is absorbed, carried through currents, and released again, shaping temperature in ways that extend far beyond any single place. These movements are not visible from a distance, but they are always happening, always influencing the conditions that define the world. The atmosphere responds. Air moves across the planet, carrying energy, redistributing heat, adjusting its composition in response to what rises from the ocean and what life contributes within it. The balance between gases continues to shift, not dramatically, not in ways that are easily noticed, but in ways that matter over time. Life remains part of this system. Every interaction, every exchange between organism and environment contributes to the cycles that sustain the planet. What is taken in is transformed and returned, influencing the composition of both ocean and atmosphere. These processes are constant, embedded within the flow of everyday existence, shaping the world without drawing attention to themselves. This is what makes them difficult to see. They do not announce their presence. They do not create obvious changes from one moment to the next, but they are always there. The air that is breathed, the water that moves through the oceans, the energy that travels across the planet, all of it is part of the same system that began forming long before life existed. The alignment between atmosphere and ocean did not end once it allowed life to emerge. It continued, deepened, and became the foundation for everything that exists now. The realization begins to take hold. The present is not separate from the past. The processes that shaped the earliest Earth are still shaping it now, carried forward through cycles that have never stopped. The balance between air and water is not something that was achieved and then left behind. It is something that is maintained moment by moment, through interactions that remain largely unseen. The world feels stable because these processes are consistent, but consistency does not mean stillness. The ocean continues to absorb and release. The atmosphere continues to adjust and respond. Life continues to participate, influencing the system in ways both small and large together. They maintain a balance that is always active, always shifting, always being created again. The sense of familiarity begins to change. What once seemed fixed now reveals itself as dynamic. The sky is not just a backdrop, the ocean is not just a surface. Both are part of a system that continues to evolve even now, even in ways that are too gradual to notice in a single moment. The ancient alignment remains, not as a memory, but as a process that continues to unfold. And because it continues, it can respond. The system that has sustained life for so long does not exist in isolation from what happens today. It reacts, adjusts, and adapts to the conditions it encounters, just as it always has. The same feedback loops that once created stability remain active, capable of absorbing change, but also capable of being influenced by it. The question begins to shift once more. If these processes are still active, still shaping the world around us, then how do they respond to new pressures, to changes that move through the system in ways that may not follow the patterns it has learned to hold? Because the balance continues, but it is not untouched. And as the present unfolds, the forces acting upon this system begin to introduce new variations, new challenges, and new conditions that the planet must now respond to, just as it has responded to everything that came before. The balance continues, but it no longer moves through the same quiet patterns it once did. The ocean still absorbs and releases, the atmosphere still shifts and responds, and life remains woven into every part of the system. Yet within these familiar cycles, new pressures begin to appear, not as sudden disruptions, but as changes that build slowly, carried within the same processes that have always sustained the planet. At first, they are difficult to notice. The ocean takes in slightly more than before, holding changes that alter its chemistry in ways that do not immediately reveal themselves. The atmosphere shifts in composition, not dramatically in a single moment, but gradually as elements accumulate or decline over time. Energy moves through the system differently, lingering longer in some regions, dispersing more quickly in others. The patterns still exist, but they begin to stretch. What once returned to balance with ease now takes longer to adjust. The feedback loops that regulate the system continue to function, but they must respond to influences that do not always align with the cycles they have maintained for so long. The adjustments are still happening, but they are becoming more complex, more layered, more demanding. Some of these pressures come from within the planet itself. Natural variations, shifts that have always been part of the system, continue to move through the cycles, altering conditions in ways that the planet has learned to absorb over time. These changes are not new. They are part of the same dynamic process that has shaped the balance from the beginning, but not all pressures follow familiar patterns. There are influences that move through the system differently, altering the interaction between atmosphere and ocean in ways that do not always match the rhythms that have formed over billions of years. These influences do not replace the existing cycles, but they interact with them, adding new variations that the system must now respond to. The difference is subtle, but it grows. The ocean, once able to absorb changes and redistribute them smoothly, begins to hold more than it can easily process in certain regions. The atmosphere, shaped by countless interactions over time, carries shifts that alter how energy is retained and released. Life, still part of the system, continues to adapt, but its interactions now contribute to patterns that are more difficult to predict. The balance is not lost, but it is under pressure. The realization begins to settle. The stability that has persisted for so long is not unbreakable. It is maintained through continuous interaction, through feedback loops that depend on conditions remaining within a range the system can manage. When those conditions begin to shift beyond that range, the system must adjust in ways that are not always immediate or complete. The planet continues to respond. It absorbs, redistributes, adapts, just as it always has. But the scale and nature of the changes it must respond to are evolving, introducing new challenges into a system that was shaped by different conditions. The sense of time begins to change. What once unfolded over vast stretches now carries effects that can accumulate more quickly, altering the balance in ways that feel more immediate, even though they are still part of the same long process. The connection between past and present becomes clearer, revealing that the system we experience now is not separate from what came before, but a continuation of it. The twist becomes impossible to ignore. The balance that took billions of years to form can be altered. Not instantly, not completely, but in ways that matter. The ocean and atmosphere remain connected. The feedback loops remain active, but the conditions they operate within are shifting. The system is still capable of adjustment, still capable of maintaining its balance, but the path it must take to do so is becoming more complex. The question begins to rise again. Not whether the balance exists, but how it will respond to these pressures, how it will adapt to changes that move through it in ways that may not follow the patterns it has relied on for so long. Because the system has always been dynamic, it has always adjusted. But now it faces a new stage, one where the forces acting upon it are changing in ways that will shape what comes next, carrying the story forward into a future that is still unfolding, still uncertain, and still part of the same continuous process that has defined the planet from the beginning. The world settles again into quiet. The ocean moves as it always has, the atmosphere shifts above it, and life continues within both, woven into every exchange, every cycle, every subtle adjustment that carries the system forward. Nothing appears unfinished, nothing feels incomplete, and yet beneath that sense of calm, something remains in motion, something that has never truly stopped. The story is still unfolding. What began as a distant alignment between air and water did not end when balance was first achieved. It did not pause when life emerged, or when the system became stable enough to sustain itself. Each moment since has been part of the same process, each interaction a continuation of what came before. The ocean still absorbs and releases. shaping the conditions of the world in ways that are rarely seen. The atmosphere still responds, adjusting its composition, redistributing energy, carrying the effects of every change across the planet. Life still participates, adapting, influencing, contributing to the cycles that have never ceased. Nothing has been left behind. The ancient processes remain, not as remnants of the past, but as active forces in the present. The same interactions that once struggled to align now operate with a quiet consistency, maintaining a balance that is always being created again. This is what makes the present feel different when seen from this perspective. What seems stable is not fixed. What feels complete is still in progress. The balance between atmosphere and ocean is not something that was achieved once and preserved unchanged. It is something that continues, shaped by every shift, every adaptation, every influence that moves through the system. The realization deepens. The story of Earth's balance is not a finished chapter. It is a continuous one. Each cycle carries forward the memory of what has already occurred, building upon it, adjusting it, reshaping it in response to new conditions. The system does not repeat itself exactly. It evolves guided by patterns that persist but never remain entirely the same. The ocean changes, the atmosphere changes, life changes, and through those changes, the balance itself changes, not in ways that erase what has come before, but in ways that extend it, allowing the system to move forward without losing its connection to its past. The alignment that once seemed fragile has become something more enduring, not because it is permanent, but because it can adapt. This is the quiet truth that emerges. The balance that made life possible is still being written, moment by moment. Each breath taken, each movement of water, each exchange between organism and environment contributes to a process that has never stopped. The present is not separate from the beginning. It is part of the same unfolding, the same continuous alignment between air and water that has shaped everything that exists. The sense of time shifts. The billions of years that formed this system do not feel distant. They feel connected, carried into the present through processes that remain active, still shaping the conditions of the world. The past is not something that has ended. It is something that continues to influence what happens now, and what happens now will influence what comes next. The story does not move toward a conclusion. It moves forward. The balance remains not as a final state, but as a process that continues to adapt, to respond, to evolve alongside the forces that shape it. There is no single moment where it is complete, no point where it no longer changes. There is only continuation, and within that continuation lies possibility. The same system that has carried the planet through its earliest instability, through the emergence of life, through cycles of disruption and recovery, now faces a future that is still unfolding. The patterns that have formed will continue to guide it, but they will also be shaped by new conditions, new interactions, new influences that are only beginning to take form. The calm remains. But it is not stillness. It is motion, steady and quiet, carrying the story forward, shaping a world that is not finished, but always becoming, always adjusting, always part of something that has no clear ending, only a continuous unfolding that remains as present now as it was at the very beginning. The world feels steady in ways that no longer draw attention. The air moves softly, the ocean follows its quiet rhythm, and life continues within both without interruption. There is no constant reminder of the forces at work, no visible signal that something extraordinary is maintaining the conditions that make everything possible. It simply feels normal. And because it feels normal, it is rarely questioned. Each breath comes without effort, drawn from an atmosphere that holds exactly what it needs to. The temperature settles within a range that allows life to continue, neither too extreme nor too unstable for long. Water flows, shifts, evaporates, and returns. Always present, always part of the cycle that sustains the world. None of this announces itself. It does not demand attention, does not reveal the complexity beneath it. The balance between atmosphere and ocean works quietly, carried by processes that have been repeating for longer than memory can reach. It feels as though it has always been this way, as though the world simply exists in this stable form. But that sense of permanence is an illusion. The conditions that feel ordinary are anything but simple. They are the result of countless interactions, each one contributing to a system that holds together with remarkable precision. The air contains what it does because it has been shaped, adjusted, and maintained through cycles that never stop. The ocean behaves as it does because it continues to absorb, release, and redistribute, guided by patterns that have formed over immense spans of time. Nothing about this balance is accidental. It is the outcome of a process that continues to unfold moment by moment, even now. The realization begins to take shape slowly. What feels stable is not fixed. What feels permanent is being maintained. The world does not hold itself in place by default. It is held there through interactions that remain largely invisible, operating beneath the surface of everyday experience. Every breath depends on that balance. Every drop of water depends on it. Every moment of stability, every sense of continuity exists because the system continues to adjust, to respond, to maintain itself in ways that are rarely seen. This is what makes it so easy to overlook. The balance does not call attention to itself. It does not create dramatic shifts that force awareness. It operates quietly, consistently, shaping the conditions of the world without interruption. The sky remains above, the ocean below, and life moves between them as though nothing could be different. But it could, and it has been the system that supports life has not always existed in this form. It has changed, evolved, and adapted through countless cycles of imbalance and recovery. The conditions that now feel stable were not guaranteed. They emerged gradually, shaped by processes that could have unfolded differently. That understanding shifts the perspective. The familiar world begins to feel less permanent, less certain, not in a way that creates alarm, but in a way that reveals how much depends on what continues to happen unseen. The balance between atmosphere and ocean is not something that exists independently of time. It is something that is constantly being created, sustained through interactions that must continue for the system to hold. The quiet awe begins to settle in, not because the world is fragile in an obvious way, but because it is precise in ways that are rarely considered. The conditions that allow life to exist are not broad or undefined. They exist within a range that is maintained through ongoing adjustment, through processes that must remain in motion for stability to persist. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The air, the water, the steady rhythm of the planet reveal themselves as part of something more complex, more interconnected than they appear. The balance is not a background condition. It is an active process, one that supports every aspect of life without ever needing to be seen. And as that awareness deepens, another thought begins to emerge. If this balance is so precise, so dependent on continuous interaction, then how easily could it shift, and what would it mean if the conditions that feel so stable were to move beyond the range that has held them for so long? The balance feels steady, but it does not stretch endlessly in every direction. It exists within limits held in place by conditions that remain within a certain range. The ocean absorbs and releases, the atmosphere shifts and responds, and life continues within that movement, but all of it depends on boundaries that are rarely seen, rarely considered, yet always present. At first, those boundaries are difficult to imagine. The air feels consistent, the temperature stable, the water reliable. There is no clear edge where balance ends and instability begins. Everything appears to move smoothly, as though the system can adjust to any change without consequence. But that is not how it works. The processes that maintain stability operate within a narrow range. Small shifts in composition, in energy, in interaction, can move the system closer to its limits. These shifts do not always lead to immediate change. They can remain subtle, carried quietly within the cycles that continue to function as they always have. Yet, over time, they matter. A slight increase in one element, a gradual change in how heat is distributed, a difference in how the ocean absorbs and releases what it holds. Each of these can alter the balance in ways that are not immediately visible. The system responds, adjusts, compensates, but those adjustments are not without boundaries. The balance is not unlimited, it is precise. The realization begins to take form slowly. What keeps the planet stable is not its ability to absorb endless variation, but its ability to remain within a range where its processes can continue to function effectively. The feedback loops between ocean, atmosphere, and life depend on conditions that allow them to operate as they have learned to do. When those conditions shift too far, the system must adjust in ways that become more difficult, more complex, and sometimes less effective. This is where the quiet tension begins to deepen. The same processes that create stability also define its limits. The ocean can absorb only so much before its ability to regulate begins to change. The atmosphere can carry only certain balances of gases before the way energy moves through it begins to shift. Life can adapt, but only within conditions that still allow it to persist. The strength of the system lies in its precision, not in its invulnerability. The balance holds because everything is connected, because each part responds to the others, adjusting continuously to maintain conditions that can support life. But those connections also mean that changes do not remain isolated. A shift in one part of the system moves through the rest, influencing interactions that extend far beyond their origin. The system remains stable, but it is sensitive. That sensitivity is not a weakness. It is what allows the system to respond, to adjust, to maintain itself through constant change. Without it, the balance would not exist at all, but it also means that the system cannot ignore what moves through it. Every change, no matter how small, becomes part of the ongoing process that shapes the planet. The boundaries are not fixed lines. They are ranges, shifting slightly over time, shaped by the same processes that maintain the system. But they are still boundaries, still defining the conditions within which stability can persist. The understanding settles more deeply. The balance that supports life is not wide and forgiving. It is held within a range that must be maintained, adjusted, and respected by the system itself. The processes that sustain the planet do not eliminate change, but they depend on that change remaining within limits they can manage. The world continues to feel stable, but now, that stability carries a different meaning. It is not something that exists without effort. It is something that exists because the system continues to operate within the conditions that allow it to hold. The air, the ocean, the life within them all remain part of this delicate alignment, sustained through interactions that must remain within a range that supports them. And as that awareness deepens, another question begins to emerge. If the balance exists within limits, if it depends on conditions that must be maintained, then what role does life itself play in keeping those conditions within range, or in pushing them toward the edges where the system must work harder to hold together? Life has always been part of the balance, woven into the cycles that connect ocean and atmosphere, shaping the system while being shaped by it. From its earliest emergence, it contributed to the stability that allowed it to persist, participating in exchanges that helped maintain the conditions it depended on. But as the story deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that is less simple, less certain, and far more complex. Life does not only preserve balance, it also changes it. At first, this dual role is difficult to see. The influence of life appears consistent, reinforcing the patterns that sustain the system. Gases are regulated, chemical processes are guided, and energy flows are shaped in ways that support continuity. Life acts as a stabilizing force, contributing to the feedback loops that allow the planet to maintain itself. But those same interactions carry the potential for change. Every process that helps regulate the system also introduces variation. Each exchange between organism and environment alters something, even if only slightly. These alterations accumulate over time, just as they always have. And as they accumulate, they begin to shift the system in new directions. The balance is not held in place. It is constantly being reshaped. This is where the duality becomes clear. Life protects the balance by participating in the cycles that maintain it. At the same time, it disrupts the balance by introducing new interactions, new patterns, new variations that the system must respond to. These two roles are not separate. They are part of the same process, unfolding together, inseparable from one another. The ocean reflects this clearly. Life within it regulates chemical composition, absorbing and releasing elements in ways that stabilize the system. Yet those same processes alter the composition of the water over time, changing how it behaves, how it interacts with the atmosphere, how it supports future forms of life. The atmosphere carries these changes forward, shaped by what rises from the ocean, responding to influences that are both stabilizing and transformative. The system is not controlled, it is influenced, and life is one of its most powerful influences. This realization shifts the perspective once again. Life is not separate from the planet, acting upon it from the outside. It is embedded within the system, part of the same network of interactions that define how the planet behaves. Its role is not to maintain a fixed balance, but to participate in a process that is always evolving. The balance that exists is not preserved unchanged, it is continuously redefined. This creates a sense of complexity that does not resolve into a simple answer. Life cannot be understood as purely protective or purely disruptive. It is both at once contributing to stability while also driving change. The same processes that sustain the system can, under different conditions, push it in new directions. The relationship is dynamic, and it has always been this way. From the earliest moments when life first began to influence the ocean and atmosphere to the present where its effects extend across the entire planet, life has played this dual role. It has helped create the conditions that allow it to exist, while also reshaping those conditions over time. The system continues to respond. The ocean adjusts, the atmosphere shifts, and life adapts, each influencing the others in a cycle that never fully settles. The balance is maintained, but it is not static. It moves, evolves, and changes, shaped by the interactions that define it. The deeper realization begins to settle in. The planet is not guided by a single force, not held in place by a single process. It is shaped by relationships, by interactions that are both stabilizing and transformative. Life is part of that relationship, inseparable from the system it helps sustain, and within that understanding lies something more subtle, a sense of connection. Not as something stated directly, but as something that emerges naturally from the realization that life and planet are not separate entities. They are part of the same ongoing process, influencing one another in ways that extend across time. The story does not divide into simple roles of cause and effect. It becomes something more fluid. Life shapes the planet shapes life, and together they continue to evolve. This is where the narrative prepares to move forward once more, not toward a conclusion, but toward a broader understanding of what this balance means, how it has shaped the past, how it defines the present, and how it will continue to influence everything that comes next. It is tempting to imagine a beginning, a single moment where everything started, where the ocean first formed, where the atmosphere settled into place, where life appeared and set the story in motion. It is just as tempting to imagine an ending, a point where the system reaches its final state, where balance is complete, where nothing more needs to change. But the story does not follow that path. What unfolds across the planet is not a sequence with clear edges. It is not divided into simple chapters with defined beginnings and conclusions. Instead, it moves as a continuous flow, each moment shaped by what came before, each interaction carrying forward into what follows. The ocean did not suddenly become what it is. The atmosphere did not appear fully formed. Life did not arrive as a final answer. Each emerged through processes that were already in motion, shaped by interactions that had no clear starting point, only earlier stages that led into them. And once they appeared, they did not settle into permanence. They continued to change, to adapt, to evolve alongside one another. The story is not something that began. It is something that has always been unfolding. Even in the earliest moments when the planet seemed chaotic and unformed, there were already patterns beginning to take shape. Interactions between elements, exchanges of energy, movements that would later become cycles were already present, already guiding what the planet would become. And those patterns did not stop. They deepened. They connected. They became the foundation for everything that followed. The balance between atmosphere and ocean did not emerge as a finished state. It formed gradually, shaped by countless interactions that aligned over time. Life did not simply appear within that balance. It became part of it, influencing it, reshaping it, carrying it forward into new forms. At no point does the story pause. At no point does it conclude. What exists now is not separate from what existed before. The present is not an endpoint. It is a continuation, a moment within a process that extends far beyond what can be easily understood. This is where the sense of time begins to shift. The billions of years that shape the planet no longer feel like distant history. They feel connected, present within the cycles that continue to operate. The ocean that moves now carries the imprint of every interaction that came before it. The atmosphere that surrounds the planet reflects changes that unfolded across immense stretches of time. Life itself is part of that continuity, shaped by the past and contributing to the future. The story has no clear beginning because every beginning is connected to something earlier. It has no clear ending because every moment leads into something that follows. The balance that supports life is not a final achievement. It is part of this continuous flow maintained through interactions that never stop, shaped by forces that are always in motion. The realization settles quietly. Earth's story is not something that can be contained within a single narrative. It is not a sequence that moves from start to finish. It is an unbroken process. The ocean, the atmosphere, and life within them are not separate elements that came together once and remained fixed. They are parts of a system that continues to evolve, to adjust, to respond to the conditions that surround it. Each moment is part of something larger. Each interaction carries forward the effects of what has already occurred. The story does not stand still. It moves, and within that movement, it creates the conditions that allow it to continue. This is what gives the planet its sense of continuity, its ability to persist without ever becoming static. The balance is not held in place by reaching an endpoint. It is sustained by remaining in motion, by continuing to unfold without interruption. There is no final moment waiting ahead, only the continuation of what has always been. And as this perspective deepens, as the story expands beyond the idea of beginnings and endings, it begins to return to something more immediate, something closer, grounding this vast continuous process in the present moment, where the same interactions still unfold, still shaping the world that is experienced now. The present does not stand apart from the past. It is not a finished state, not a point where the long movement of ocean, atmosphere, and life has finally come to rest. Instead, it exists within that movement, shaped by it, carried forward by processes that began long before this moment and will continue long after it. The air that surrounds the planet now is not separate from what came before. It carries the result of countless exchanges, shaped by interactions that have unfolded across vast stretches of time. The ocean, moving beneath it, holds the memory of those same processes, its chemistry, its motion, its structure, all part of a system that has never stopped adjusting. Nothing has been completed. Everything continues. The balance that exists today feels stable, but it is not final. It is a phase, a moment within a larger sequence of interactions that are still unfolding. The cycles between air and water, the feedback loops shaped by life, the continuous adjustments that maintain the system are all active, all part of the present as much as they were part of the past. This changes the way the present can be understood. It is not the result of history. It is history continuing. Each interaction that occurs now, each exchange between ocean and atmosphere, each response from life itself becomes part of the same process that has shaped the planet from the beginning. The present is not separate from that process. It is where it is currently unfolding. The realization begins to settle more deeply. What feels stable is temporary, not in the sense that it will disappear suddenly, but in the sense that it is always moving, always adjusting, always part of something that does not stop. The conditions that define the world today exist because they are being maintained, because the system continues to operate within the ranges that allow it to hold. The ocean continues to absorb and release. The atmosphere continues to shift and respond. Life continues to interact, shaping and being shaped by the system around it. All of it is happening now. The present moment is not a pause in the story. It is part of its continuation, part of the same unfolding that began long ago and has never ceased. The patterns that formed in the earliest stages of the planet still guide what happens today, not as fixed rules, but as processes that continue to adapt and evolve. This creates a sense of connection, not just between past and present, but between everything that exists within the system. The air that is breathed, the water that moves, the conditions that allow life to continue are all part of the same ongoing interaction. Nothing stands outside of it. Everything participates. The understanding shifts quietly. The world is not something observed from a distance. It is something that is being experienced from within, as part of the same system that continues to shape itself. The present is not a stable endpoint that can be separated from what came before. It is a moment within a process that carries forward, shaped by every interaction that has occurred and every interaction that is still to come. This is what gives the present its meaning, not as a final state, but as a continuation. The balance between atmosphere and ocean is not something that was achieved and then preserved unchanged. It is something that is being maintained now through processes that remain active, through interactions that continue to unfold. The realization becomes clear. The world that is experienced today is not the result of the past. It is the past continuing, and within that continuation lies something more, because if the present is part of this ongoing process, if it is shaped by the same interactions that have always defined the planet, then it is also part of what will shape the future. The balance that exists now will not remain unchanged. It will continue to evolve, to adjust, to respond to the forces that move through it. The story moves forward, not toward an end, but toward what comes next. And as this understanding settles, as the present becomes fully integrated into the continuous flow of the planet's history, the narrative begins to turn toward its final reflection, toward the question of what this ongoing balance means for the future, and how the system that has carried the planet this far will continue to shape what lies ahead. The story does not arrive at an ending. It softens, it settles, and then it continues just as it always has. The ocean moves without pause, the atmosphere shifts without announcement, and life carries on within the balance that has never stopped adjusting. There is no moment where everything concludes, no signal that the process has reached its final form. It simply goes on. The silence returns, not as emptiness, but as something filled with motion that no longer calls attention to itself. The same exchanges between air and water continue, the same cycles repeat, the same interactions unfold beneath the surface of what can be easily seen. Nothing declares their presence, nothing marks their importance, and yet they remain constant. The balance persists. It does not hold itself in place through stillness. It holds through movement, through processes that never stop shifting, never stop responding. The ocean absorbs and releases. The atmosphere carries and redistributes. Life interacts and adapts. Each part continues to influence the others, shaping a system that remains active even when it appears calm. This is where the story becomes hardest to notice, because nothing dramatic is happening. There are no sudden changes, no visible transformations that signal the continuation of the process. The world feels stable, complete, as though everything that needed to happen has already taken place. But beneath that feeling, the same forces that shaped the earliest moments of the planet are still at work. They have simply become quiet. The realization settles slowly. The story never ended. It became too subtle to see. The ocean still carries the memory of every interaction that formed it, but it expresses that memory through cycles that feel ordinary. The atmosphere still reflects the changes shaped over billions of years, but it does so in ways that feel constant. Life continues to participate, to influence, to adapt, but its role is embedded within the system so deeply that it no longer appears separate from it. Everything continues, without interruption, without announcement. The sense of stillness begins to change. It is no longer the absence of movement. It is the presence of movement that has become so consistent, so continuous, that it fades into the background of awareness. The balance between atmosphere and ocean is not something that can be pointed to in a single moment. It is something that exists across every moment, carried forward through interactions that do not stop. The world does not pause. It does not reach a final state. It remains in motion, guided by the same processes that have always defined it. The ocean shifts, the atmosphere responds, life continues, and through all of this the balance holds, not as something fixed, but as something maintained through constant adjustment. The cycles repeat, but they are never exactly the same. Each moment carries slight variations, slight changes that become part of what follows. The story unfolds quietly. It does not demand attention. It does not ask to be seen, but it is always there. the realization becomes almost imperceptible. The same forces that shaped the earliest Earth are still shaping the present. The same interactions that once struggled to align now operate with a quiet precision, maintaining conditions that allow life to continue without ever needing to be noticed. The silence is not empty. It is full of motion, full of interaction, full of processes that continue whether they are observed or not. The balance persists, carried forward through time, shaped by everything that has come before and everything that is still unfolding. There is no conclusion waiting at the end, only continuation. The story does not close. It settles into the quiet rhythm that has always defined it, a rhythm that moves without pause, without announcement, without end. And within that quiet, within that steady and almost invisible motion, the planet continues, carrying its oceans, its atmosphere, and the life within them through a process that has never stopped, a process that remains as present now as it was at the very beginning. The silence remains, and the story continues,